Welcome to Lecture 7 on Sensation, Biological Psychology. In this lecture, we're going to talk about general principles of perception. Each receptor is specialized to absorb one kind of energy and transduce it into an electrochemical pattern in the brain. In other words, the brain sees the activity of the optic nerve and hears the activity of the auditory nerve. Cells can signal one kind of stimulus by an increase in firing rate and a different signal with a decrease in firing rate. The general laws of specific nerve energies are that each nerve carries a particular sensation, such as vision or touch, and the brain interprets the nervous messages based on which cell carries the message, not based on the content of the message. The eye and its connections to the brain. The pupil, an opening in the center of the iris, which is a band of tissue that gives our eyes their color, this is where the light enters the eye. The pupil is focused by an adjustable lens and the cornea, which is not adjustable, and projected onto the retina. The retina, or the rear surface of the eye, is lined with visual receptors, and it's the route within the retina that goes down the optic nerves. When we look in the retina, we're looking at rods and cones, two types of the receptors that exist. The rods are abundant in the periphery around the outside of the retina, and they're involved in both peripheral and also night vision. Cones are found mostly in the fovea, or pretty much in the center, and they're involved both in visual acuity and color vision. In humans, the ratio of rods to cones is 20 rods for every single cone. Color vision requires comparing the responses of different types of cones. Animals, for example rats, they only have one type of cone and cannot discriminate one color from another. There is an aspect called opponent process theory, and here's an example of this. I'm going to show an image on here, and I'm going to leave the image up for exactly 30 seconds. You just stare right at the middle of this image, and when it goes away, see if you can get a negative after image. So here comes the image for 30 seconds. Just keep staring right at the center of the image. Just keep staring right at the center of the image. Just keep staring. And now, did you get a negative after image? The negative color after image is this visual phenomena that occur when you stare at a colored object under a bright light without moving your head. And you look at a plain white surface, you should see a replacement of the red that you've been staring at with green, and green with red, and yellow with blue, etc. This is the opponent process theory. Color vision deficiencies, or otherwise known as color blindness, is the inability to perceive color differences as most people actually do. The red-green color blindness is the most common form of this disorder, and it's actually also primarily seen in males. Some women have some women are able to have 4 different types of cones, and these women have 2 kinds of long wave cone receptors that can make for finer color distinctions than other people. Now this gene for our color cones is on our X chromosome, so only women can have both kinds of long wave receptors. The neural basis of visual perception. Receptive fields, the portion of the visual field that excites or inhibits a specific cell in the visual system of the brain. In class now we're going to be doing a blind spot activity, and since we're not in class right now, we're not going to be doing the blind spot activity. The pattern recognition of the cerebral cortex. Most axons from the eye go to the primary visual cortex. Let me just change the picture here. The primary visual cortex back here in the back. This area of the cortex is responsible for the first stage of visual processing. There's a condition called blind sight. In the blind sight, the ability to respond in some way to the visual information after extensive damage to the primary visual cortex. That is, people with blind sight will respond to stimulus, but they'll report that they actually cannot see it. At present, the reason for blind sight is actually unclear, and it's also a very rare condition. We look at the pathways in the visual cortex. There's three that we want to look at. The ventral stream. This is the pathway that's sensitive to shape and movement and color brightness, and it leads directly back to the temporal cortex. These pathways are called the Watt pathways because they are specialized for identifying and recognizing objects. Another pathway is called the dorsal stream, and this is the pathway that leads to the parietal cortex. That's this area going right across on both sides of the brain here. That leads to the parietal cortex and is associated with integrating vision and movement. This pathway is the where or how pathway, and it helps the motor system find objects, move toward them, grasp them, and so forth. And then we have the shape pathway. And the shape pathway deals with features. Neurons whose responses indicate the presence of a particular feature, the fact that prolonged exposure to a given visual feature decreases sensitivity to that feature, really does support this concept. The inferior temporal cortex, and if I go back here, we're looking at the inferior temporal cortex to be right around in this area here. The inferior temporal cortex, neurons in this brain region provide information about complex shaped stimuli. The area is important for shape constancy, that is the ability to recognize an object's shape even as it approaches, it retreats, it rotates, it moves around in some fashion. That here you can see that this shape is the same as this shape, even though it's changed. This one's farther away, this one's closer. They're tilted slightly. I don't know how anybody could recognize those were the same shape. But this has to do with in the area of your inferior temporal cortex. There are some disorders of object recognition. There's visual agnosia, and this is the inability to recognize objects despite otherwise normal vision. Tough to pronounce prosopagnosia is the inability to recognize faces without an overall loss of vision or memory. The inferior temporal cortex is largely specialized for face recognition. It is also activated when identifying things like car models and bird species and so forth. But we are, as human beings, we're face recognizers. We like our faces. And then I have a couple of videos that I'm not going to show here in class, or on this video, because of copyright issues, but we will see these in class. The color, motion, and depth pathways. Cells respond selectively to a stimulus moving in a particular direction and somewhat to still photographs that imply movement. The brain has mechanisms to distinguish between moving objects and visual changes due to head movements. Damage to certain brain areas result in people becoming motion blind, that is, unable to determine where our objects are moving or even if they are moving. In the development of the visual system, specifically by humans, human infants have better visual abilities than was once imagined, as infants spend more time looking at faces than at patternless displays. The ability to recognize faces up into adolescence, it is most accurate for faces similar to those that the observer is familiar with seeing. Early experiences in the visual development. During our early development, the visual system forms synaptic connections similar to the rest of the brain. However, the visual system needs normal visual experience to maintain and fine-tune its connections. If we're deprived of visual sensation in one eye, most neurons in the visual cortex receive binocular input, that is, stimulation from both eyes. If deprived of light stimulation in one eye early in life, they'll become almost blind in that eye. If they're deprived of visual experience in both eyes, then the cortical cells will remain responsive, although very, very sluggish in both eyes. Almost every neuron in the human visual cortex responds appropriately to corresponding stimulus in both eyes. The retinal disparity is a discrepancy between what the left eye sees versus what the right eye sees. Retinal disparity is necessary for stereotopic depth perception, and fine-tuning of this binocular vision depends on this experience. Strabismus, sometimes these words are hard to pronounce. Strabismus is a condition in which the eyes do not point in the same directions. Individuals born with this disorder cannot perceive depth better with two eyes than with one. There is also a condition called lazy eye. It's a condition in which a child ignores the vision in one eye, sometimes even letting it drift in a different direction from the other eye. This disorder is treated by putting a patch over the active eye, forcing the child to use the ignored eye. The patch is most effectively if it's used early, though humans do not appear to have sharply defined critical period. In the next section of this lecture, we'll talk about audition.